Hello, and welcome to this episode of Human Rights Magazine. My name is Derek McCush. In February 2021, Myanmar military leaders removed the democratically elected party from power and took control of the government. In the year following, at least 1,700 civilians, including children, have been killed by the junta forces, with some 10,000 people arrested. Media outlets have been closed, and journalists have been arrested, beaten, and tortured. Some have been killed. Yet, some independent journalists continue their efforts despite the repression. In this podcast, Ruloan Ma speaks with people directly engaged in journalism in Myanmar.
On February 1st, 2021, Myanmar's military staged a coup to seize the power from the democratically elected party, the National League of Democracy. Since then, under military rule, access to internet is blocked and security forces are distributed to punish political dissent with extreme measures. Under such dire situation, as the messenger of the truth, the journalists in Myanmar are criminalized for doing their job. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, Myanmar has become the world's second worst jailer of journalists. To better understand the situation of journalists in Myanmar, I spoke to three experts in the field. Ruloan Ma is a current activist and journalist in Myanmar. She first told me an inspiring story of how a refugee from an ethnic minority group becomes a journalist.
When I was young, I want to be a doctor because my parents are medical staff, but there is no opportunity for us as a refugees. We cannot go to the university. We cannot go to anywhere in other place. So some people end up with to become a teacher, health worker, and other social work. Yeah, for me, I just joined the student groups, and then my career changed when the top leaders came into the camp and talk about the radio program. I'm very curious about it. And then I just joined their programs, and then I really like it. It's good for me. You have to deal with other people, and then you have to manage what you are doing. So my life as a journalist is like that. And then they asked me, do you want to continue your study? Of course, I want to continue my study. So this is an opportunity for you because we are working with our community radio. You want to go to study like a basic journalism, like a refugee student. You have no choice. So you got this choice. Why not? I will go for sure. This is not like a professional, but because we are stateless, we have nothing. We got opportunity. The organization that organized it for us, just to train us like a citizen journalist, to do our story as much as we can. But they call the trainer is very famous, like Christopher Gunn. He used to be a BBC journalist since 1988 in Burma, and also Tony Chan. He's very famous journalist from BBC and also Al Jazeera.
After gaining the professional skills of a journalist, Ruloan Ma helped to develop the community program to better serve the Korean community, as she believes radio is one of the best tools to reach people and provide them with the information they need.
We call it community radio, so it's not controlled by the government. Community own it. Community have to do it. So we did it in the jungle. And then we try to recruit the young people to work on it. We try to encourage them, educate them that radio program is very good for our community. When there is no signal, I'm working with a radio program since I was in high school until I become a trainer. And then we are running our radio program in Korean areas, some Korean areas. Because of the cut off the telephone signal, internet signal, everything, only radio is the first tools that reach the people. So this is my goal, that I want to work with this. I want to improve this in our areas. And I used to be in Canada. I volunteer community radio because I really want to know about the community radio and how to improve it.
As a journalist from Myanmar, Nosamu finds the deprivation of press freedom puts her in a dilemma of choosing to be a good journalist and protecting her own safety.
Because of the dictator, because not only after the coup, the Burmese government always arrest the journalists because there is no freedom of expression, and then there is no right for the journalists to report the truth. As a journalist, we have to report the truth. We cannot be biased. We have an ethic, so we try our best. But you can see that detain, arrest, almost the time. So it's a little bit hard for journalists inside Burma. When I work with Radio Free Asia, my editor asked me to rewrite my script because I tell the truth, talk about it. The Burmese army rape case, and then I just explain very detailed. And then the editor said, you cannot say like that. It's very scary, like it's not appropriate to audience to listen to it. You can just say that the Burmese army raped this girl, blah, 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 something like that. But for me, I just wrote it very detailed. So sometimes because we have a feeling, we have been suffer for many years. So sometimes I got like angry, and I just want to say everything that the world will know what the Burmese army did to the people, not only the majority or minority, they just want to do whatever they want. So they asked me to rewrite it. So I have to rewrite it.
To avoid this situation, many journalists from Myanmar are forced to flee overseas and report there. While they have done an amazing job providing well-rounded information in a safer environment, Nasamu believes this is not a perfect strategy.
For me, as a journalist, I just want to go and see and observe and like curious and interview the people on the ground and report it. But if you are in the other country, how can you do that? You cannot observe what happened in Myanmar, and then you cannot interview people face by face.
Fortunately, during the difficult time, journalists from all ethnicities in Myanmar are sticking together against a military dictatorship, although there has been ethnic conflicts happening in the country throughout the decades.
We don't need to talk about the ethnicity or other things. All the journalists will face the same.
The next expert I spoke to is Phil Thornton, who is a journalist and senior advisor to the International Federation of Journalists in Southeast Asia. According to Thornton, the military has made it a crime for journalists to do their job.
There's no press freedom or freedom of expression or freedom of assembly in Burma at the moment, or Myanmar as it's also known. Not long after the coup in February 1, 2021, the military outlawed most of the independent media, restricting journalists from working. And that worked in two ways. One, it made them virtually illegal to do the job. And secondly, the companies couldn't go on paying them. So suddenly a large number of people were without income or able to earn a salary to feed their families, etc. First of all, the military's strategy was to cut the voices of dissent. And they did that by attacking internet access for people. So people couldn't get information from the internet. And in a country that depends largely for receiving its news from the internet, that was a massive blow. Many of the journalists and media outlets that were closed down, many of them fled, quite arduous journey to reach borders on the country's edges. So places like India, China, and Thailand became escape routes for many journalists. Some of those people have managed to set up again, but again, it's not the same as working in your own country and getting people to buy your newspaper or buy your content. This time, people are mainly relying on giving it for free on the minimum amount of internet services that they have. I think it's more out of necessity, many of the media outlets have gone into exile. Some have stopped working. And again, you're not allowed to work as a journalist, a free independent journalist in Myanmar without being arrested or jailed. At the moment, there's over 135 journalists have been arrested. 3 have been killed while working. 52 are now in jail. 42 of those are men and 13 are women. And they've been charged with violation of community acts, terrorism acts, and just for criticizing either the military or the military appointed state administration council. In a sense, it's a crime to be a journalist, an independent journalist in Myanmar. It's the second most dangerous country in the world for journalists after China. And it's not a big country. We're not talking, the population is just around 60 million people.
To better restrict the journalists and people who challenge the military's authority in general, the military created Penal Code Section 505A, which prohibits causing fear, spreading false news, and agitating crimes against a government employee. Violating this law leads to up to 3 years of imprisonment.
You could use 505 in any form. It basically says if you criticize the military, the state administration council in any form, it's jailable by up to 3 years. That's the simple version of it, but it's not much more complicated than that. It's a tool. This is not an elected government. This is a military that took power illegally, and it's using whatever means it can, whether it's shutting down the internet, whether it's arresting people for having a VPN number, arresting people for having Facebook content, sharing a document or an article that they deem critical of the government. And they're arresting people, journalists, they're arresting many citizens. Around 14,000 citizens have been arrested for similar trumped up forms of legalese, if you like, to enforce that control over the population. And when you get arrested in Myanmar too, it's not a simple case of you're arrested like you do in a country that has rule of law. In this case, you're dragged off to interrogation centers. Your children could be dragged off. If you're not at your home when they come to arrest you, they'll often take family members in your place. And for X number of days, you're going to be tortured, interrogated, and made to endure all forms of psychological terror. Not able to wash for 4 or 5 days, made to sit in cramped positions, kicked, beaten, shown news reports from exiled media, even if you've had nothing to do with it, and slapped every time or hit quite violently because of what's appeared in the media. This is a military totally out of control.
Thornton believes such an extreme method is a desperate act for the military to assert their authority, as they have lost the people's support in Myanmar.
Even the constitution, they violate their own constitution. Remember, this is a constitution that was written by and drafted by the military. It took them 14 years, and they got it fairly the way they wanted it to be. It doesn't reflect the general population's point of view at all. They had a referendum just after Cyclone Nargis and said they had a massive, almost 100% turnout, which is a total nonsense. It was used against the general population. You got to remember, most people in Burma or Myanmar took to the streets in protest. The NLD, or the National League of Democracy, had won a massive over 80% of the vote, whereas the military-backed party, USDP, only achieved around 14%. So overwhelmingly, the population had voted for the NLD. The military saw this as a threat to its power, and its power is cemented in the number of companies and corporations that it runs independently without any scrutiny or having to pay taxes. So this was a great threat not only to its political power, but also to its economic power. And because of those reasons, that's why the coup was put in place. And then after that, it was a case of closing down the voices of dissent. And then, as I think 70 hospitals went on strike, doctors, civil servants, train drivers, universities and schools are still not open. And at the moment, the country is in the middle of a brutal civil war, where young people who were protesters stopped peacefully protesting when they fled to jungle areas or areas under the control of ethnic armed groups. They've now taken up arms and are fighting against the military.
Assistance from the international community was expected to stop the military's atrocity. However, in one of Thornton's articles, he mentioned that people in Myanmar had lost hope in international intervention.
I think people still, to a certain extent, would like to see some international intervention, but they realize they've been fighting military control since 1962, a military government in one form or another, except for a few loose years from 2015 to 2021. And in that time, there hasn't been a lot of international intervention other than diplomatic intervention. And even critics within the UN have criticized its lack of doing anything to stop it. 10,000, low estimate, were killed, murdered by the military, 2017. And 4 years later, we had a coup where we've got over 2,000 people killed by the military and 14,000 jailed. And yet we've had nothing more than sanctions. And in some cases, those sanctions haven't been endorsed by Universal. The UN Security Council has failed to unanimously punish or do much to stop.
Fortunately, we can still see international organizations, such as IFJ, that have been sparing no efforts in lending a helping hand to journalists in need.
IFJ is working with its affiliate, Myanmar Journalists Network, and trying to work out ways and means of encouraging journalists to keep working and to keep supplying news. And it's also developing things like trying to get journalists to be safe in their working. There's not a union coverage of journalists within journalists. It probably reflects the international situation generally with unionism, but there is a need. For example, there's a need for international media, if they're using content from Burma, to pay those journalists. There's a need to recognize the media groups that is producing footage. We hear cases that there's international media groups who are asking Myanmar journalists to remove their logo from their footage and replacing it and badging it with their own, and not paying for the footage. That's a serious issue that we're looking at the moment, thinking of tackling in some way with the Myanmar journalists. You won't find much traction of news from Myanmar in any of the international newspapers. It's very rarely mentioned. And to say that, there's not many journalists who actually come and try to access the situation. It's difficult for journalists, international journalists, because access is quite precarious. You really can't get into the country. And if you do, then you may be violating other states' borders. So it places international journalists in a difficult situation. But there's hundreds of Myanmar journalists who are desperate to keep working, but they do need to be paid for the content that they produce. They're doing it at great risks to themselves and their families. Wearing a press signage in Burma makes you a target. I've personally known 4 or 5 journalists who've been severely injured because of having signage on their helmet or on their vest, or being seen to be carrying a camera or a tape recorder. They've been sniped, hand smashed, shot in the face by rubber bullets. When I say rubber bullets, it's not the large rubber bullet, but the grape size, which does significant amount of damage, especially if it hits you in the eye. But they've been targeted specifically because they're reporting the situation.
As for the future of journalism in Myanmar, Thornton believes there is still hope.
Burma are incredibly enthusiastic and keen to keep working. Many of them are showed up now in small safe houses, 10 people to a house, trying to work out ways that they can keep working and keep broadcasting, whether it's on a Facebook platform or a social media platform or just their own website. They're working. Even in the last couple of days, I've talked to journalists who've been, as I said, shot in the face from close range with rubber bullets and are still keen to work and not looking to resettle to a third country. Some are, but many are not. The main concern they have at the moment is that their families may be targeted or will be targeted if they keep reporting under their real name. So the hope for journalism in Burma is quite strong because it's not necessarily an occupation like we see it in the West. It's more like a vocation. They're very keen and they have a cause, and the cause is democracy. This is what they're struggling and wanting to write about. So they're very motivated. They keep massively motivated. And it's very unlike, I know young journalists in the West who do a couple of years of college, university, then spend 2 or 3 years working in the field, and then they drop out and be communication spokespeople for public service organizations. So the same intensity that the young journalists from Burma bring is often missed in our countries where we have freedoms.
The last expert I spoke to was Oliver Slow, an award-winning British journalist who has spent the past decade reporting across Southeast Asia, mainly Myanmar. As a journalist who works in a space with a guaranteed amount of press freedom, Slow thinks that extreme media censorship has created a destructive effect on how the general public view news media.
I think right now we're seeing a rise of, not just in Myanmar, but around the world, authoritarian states that are creating massive distrust in media. I think we saw it probably most prominently with someone like Donald Trump, who really did spread this distrust of media with his narrative around fake news. And then I think other global leaders have seen that kind of worked in many ways to create distrust and then built upon that. I think the internet has obviously been a huge issue as well. We've seen the rise of the internet, we've seen the rise of lots of different outlets and lots of narratives that essentially create distrust in media, which has just then spread this kind of skepticism. And then I think finally, if you look at the media everywhere is really struggling financially. The traditional model of print advertising has completely disappeared, I think, with the rise of the internet, with the rise of social media, and traditional media outlets are really struggling to keep up, which has dwindled their resources, which has made it difficult for them to really put the resources needed into quality reporting, which I think further erodes trust.
Similar to any journalist based in Myanmar, Slow came across many obstacles when he was reporting from them, and the difficulty escalates as the military's control tightens.
I think in Myanmar, there's important differentiations to make. When I was in Myanmar between 2012 and 2019, 2020, there were some restrictions in place, but it wasn't too bad. Basically, if you're reporting on the military in Myanmar, it made it sometimes quite difficult or a little bit confusing, or you'd face some restrictions or some pressure. A couple of examples around, in 2015, when I was at Frontier, we reported on essentially what was some conflict between top members of the military-linked political party, the USDP. And that kind of created a lot of tension and a lot of pressure behind the scenes in terms of the reporting. And similarly, in 2017, when the Rohingya crisis took place, again at Frontier, we were pushing back against the military and the government narrative. They said that essentially crimes against humanity or horrendous crimes against the Rohingya weren't being committed. They said that these were clearance operations, but we were pretty adamant that things were happening there, were essentially the US has now said was a genocide against the Rohingya. So that created a lot of pressures, that created a lot of fear among our staff. It created our staff receiving death threats, receiving threatening messages online. We had to take precautions to really look after our security. And it was a pretty scary time. But I would say it's very important. The situation when I was there to compare to the situation now is completely different. The military has essentially decided that it's cracked down on essentially on every aspect of resistance, but it's particularly including that goes after the media. It shut down some media outlets within a few days of the coup. It's trying to restrict access to online information, and it's arrested journalists, threatened journalists, tortured journalists, and I believe some journalists have been killed. So that creates this massive sense of distrust, this massive sense of fear. And it makes difficulties in everything you do. They've shut down the internet. It makes it difficult for reporters to reach their contacts. They're not sure if these people will be government informants. And even when they're publishing news, a lot of these websites are blocked by the military. I think Myanmar right now is probably one of the most difficult places to be a journalist.
Slow also believes that the international community hasn't done enough for Myanmar people, partly because of the rapid change in the international news cycles.
I think it's been a frustration for many Myanmar people is how the story happening there has disappeared from international news. We saw in the media aftermath of the coup, we saw a lot of coverage. Then as time went on, of course, it fell from the international radar. That unfortunately is the news cycle and how things work, but it's a frustration I know for the Myanmar people. The Ukraine conflict was a contributing factor to that because suddenly all this focus was on Ukraine. But certainly I think it's been an important part of the reporting is to let people know that even though it's now 18 months since the coup, these atrocities are still happening. Just today I read something about, we had another incident of someone involved in the resistance who was arrested and then his body was returned. It looks like maybe had been tortured to death. So that's still happening. A few days ago, was it just last week, we saw the execution of 4 people involved in the resistance. That got some media attention, but again, it was pretty short-lived. Things moved on quite quickly. So I think it's absolutely crucial what these journalists are doing and continue to report. And I think the aim is definitely to let people know that things are still continuing in that country. Things are really quite difficult for them still. Frankly, I don't think the international community has done nearly enough. And I think the only way the current situation will be brought to an end is if the military is removed from power. They're the ones who are committing these atrocities everywhere you look. The only way this will end is the military being essentially destroyed from within.
As he explained in his book, Return of the Junta, Slow believes there are many things the international community can do to undermine the military's power.
And that means the international community doing things like supporting efforts for international justice and accountability. We're seeing cases at the ICJ. We're seeing cases under universal jurisdiction, in particular for the atrocities against the Rohingya. And one way to address that is for countries to support those trials moving forward and lend resources and support to them. But I think for me, one of the most important is to target the military's finances. And we've seen some countries put in place some sanctions. Obviously, Canada are putting in place some sanctions. The UK have put in place some sanctions. USA have put in place some sanctions. But a lot of countries have done nothing to cut off the access to the junta's funds. And I think that will be the most, and a lot more. There needs to be a global cohesive effort to target the military's finances. I think that's the most important step to be taken. Just clarify that targeted sanctions are the most important. I think we had broad-based economic sanctions in the past, and what those did was they actually hurt the Myanmar people because they were the ones who were hurt by these sort of broad-based sanctions. So what I'm talking about here is more targeted sanctions against the military, against anyone linked with the military in any way. Other steps is spoken about the impunity question. I think an arms embargo. There are a lot of calls for the UN Security Council to put in place an arms embargo. The Security Council has been, again, really disappointing in its response to the coup. That's largely because of the vetoes held by China and Russia. But no one's tabled any resolutions on Myanmar at the Security Council. And I think democratic countries need to at least be taking steps to put in place things like an arms embargo against the Myanmar military. And another question, I think, is to look at the emergence and supporting the democratic opposition. That's the National Unity Government. They are formed of MPs who won the election in 2020, which the military annulled with its coup. The NUG has come out with some pretty progressive ideas in Myanmar. It's come up with, it said it will essentially grant justice and citizenship for the Rohingya, which didn't happen in the past. It's discussed the idea of a federal constitution. In Myanmar, that's a huge deal, because it's been ruled from the center for decades. So I think the next step on this journey really for the international governments is to be supporting the National Unity Government. That's holding meetings with them, that's providing finances to them, providing training about how they can really build up their resources and be recognized as the government of Myanmar. Because what the Myanmar military craves as well, it does crave legitimacy. It wants to be recognized around the world as a government of Myanmar. It's tried since the coup to bill itself as a legitimate government of Myanmar, and it's failed miserably in that. And I think it's really important for international governments to look at supporting the democratic opposition, and that's someone like the NUG. Now, it can be quite a complicated process because countries say that they don't support parties, they don't support governments, they support states. But I think we've seen the huge support for the NUG. And I think what democratic countries need to be doing is showing their support for them. As things stand, there isn't a future for journalism in Myanmar, but that could change. And I think the current situation, I don't see changing anytime soon, but that's not to say in 5-10 years, the military could be removed from power. And then a new kind of more democratic order might start to form inside Myanmar. Now, again, that would probably be a very messy process, a very difficult one. But what we have seen is, I think, a massive recognition from Myanmar people of the importance of civil society, the importance of free and good access to information, and all these sorts of things.
Slow is also optimistic about the future of journalism in Myanmar, as he is confident with the professionalism of the Myanmar journalists.
So I think right now, no, I don't think being a journalist in Myanmar is a good career, but that's not to say that if the situation changes, say a decade from now, say 5 years from now, if the military is eventually removed, then sure, I think there is a space for independent media. I was in Myanmar when an emergence from dictatorship was happening, say a decade or so ago, and there was an emergence of a lot of independent news outlets. And we hired a lot of Myanmar people who okay, they didn't have a lot of training, and it took sometimes a lot of work to try and get them up to certain standards. But eventually, over time, we saw the emergence of really good journalists, really good news outlets doing important stuff. So as I say, if the military could be removed, then I don't see why that couldn't happen again.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Human Rights Magazine. The podcast is brought to you by the Upstream Journal. I invite you to consider supporting the program and the magazine with a contribution through PayPal as you explore other episodes.